I didn't mean to find the cemetery. I was just hiking through the countryside, following a trail that wasn't on my map. The trees were thick, their branches tangled overhead, blocking most of the sunlight. The air was still, almost too quiet, when I stumbled onto the clearing. There, hidden among the tall grass, were gravestones, old, cracked, and covered in moss. Some of the stones leaned heavily, their inscriptions barely legible, while others were nearly swallowed by the earth. Despite its abandonment, a few graves had fresh flowers resting on them, bright against the gray and green. It didn't make sense. Who would come all the way out here for this? As I wandered deeper, I noticed a man sitting under a massive oak tree. He wore dark, simple clothes and stared at a headstone in front of him, his expression blank. I stopped walking, unsure if I should say something or just turn back. Before I could decide, he looked up. His gaze wasn't curious or startled. It was sharp, knowing, like he'd been waiting for me. "You didn't come here by accident, did you?" he asked, standing slowly. His voice is quiet but firm, and it cuts through the silence like a blade. "I was just hiking," I reply, my throat dry. He shakes his head. "No one just hikes here." He holds up a small, weathered leather ledger and flips it open. The pages are filled with names, dates, and brief, cryptic notes I can't read from where I stand. Then he shows me the bottom of the list. My name is there. Beside it is today's date. "What the hell is this?" I stammer, stepping back. The man steps forward, the ledger still open in one hand. With the other, he pulls a small, gleaming blade from his coat pocket. It's not long, but it looks sharp, and the way he holds it tells me he knows how to use it. "It's your turn now," he says, his tone calm, almost pitying. My heart pounds as I step back again, my boots crunching against dry leaves. I don't wait for him to explain. I turn and bolt toward the tree lean, the sound of his footsteps chasing me. The forest blurs as I run, branches tearing at my arms and face. I don't stop until I reach the road where my car is parked. Gasping for breath, I glance back, half expecting to see him emerge from the woods. But there's nothing, only the trees, swaying slightly in the breeze. Relief floods me as I climb into the car. But when I turn on the wipers to clear the dust from the windshield, I notice something tucked under one blade, a white envelope. I rip it open, my hands shaking. Inside is the ledger, the pages exactly as I saw them. My name is now crossed out. Beneath it, another name has been added, with tomorrow's date next to it. I slam the envelope shut and throw it onto the passenger seat. As I drive away, I can't shake the feeling that I haven't escaped anything at all. Something or someone has just passed their turn on to me. The first thing I noticed about my new apartment was the view. It wasn't particularly scenic, just another row of windows from the building across the street. But there was something captivating about it, especially at night. Every evening at 9 p.m., a single window on the fourth floor flickered as if the bulb inside struggled to stay alive. At first, I barely paid attention. "It's just a flickering light," I told myself. But one night, as I was washing dishes, I looked up and froze. Someone was standing in the window. They weren't doing anything, just staring directly at me. The next night, they were there again. Same window, same unnerving stare. I tried to ignore it, but by the fourth night, they began holding up signs. Scribbled on one was, "Do you see them too?" That sent a shiver through me. I couldn't make sense of it. Them? Was this some kind of prank? I considered shutting the curtains, but a part of me needed to know what they'd do next. On the sixth night, the light didn't flicker. The window was dark. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease until I heard the knocking at my door. It wasn't frantic, just steady, deliberate. I peered through the peephole, but saw no one. My heart pounded as I hesitated to open it. Then the knocking stopped, replaced by a faint whisper through the door. You were supposed to respond. Against all instinct, I opened the door. Standing there was a man, his face gaunt, his clothes rumpled like he'd been wearing them for days. In his hand was a photograph. He handed it to me without a word. I stared at the photo, my stomach twisting. It was of me, sitting at my kitchen table, taken from inside my own apartment. Scrawled across the bottom were the words, "Too late now." Before I could say anything, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breathing heavy. I ran to the window and yanked the curtains closed, my mind racing. The next day, I tried to explain it to the landlord, but she looked at me like I was crazy. "No one's lived in that building for years," she said. I didn't go back to my apartment that night, or ever again. I packed what little I could carry and moved to a different part of the city. But even now, I catch myself glancing at windows at night, half expecting to see a figure staring back. Because whoever or whatever they were, they hadn't just been watching me. They wanted something more, and I'm terrified they'll come back to finish what they started. My friends and I had heard rumors about the abandoned carnival on the edge of town, and after a few drinks, it seemed like the perfect spot for late-night exploring. The entrance was still intact, its faded banner reading, "Welcome to Whimsy World." The colors had long faded, and the metal gate creaked ominously as we pushed it open. The grounds were eerie in the moonlight. Rides stood frozen in time, their paint chipped and their once bright lights shattered. The wind whistled through empty stalls, rattling the long-forgotten prizes still hanging on fraying strings. Then we found it, the Ferris wheel. It was the only ride that looked relatively intact. The cars were rusted but still hanging in place. As I stepped closer, I noticed something scrawled on the inside of one of the cars. "Don't let it stop. Let's spin it," my friend Nate suggested, already climbing onto the control platform. I laughed nervously, brushing it off as another one of his bad ideas. But before I could stop him, he yanked on the rusted lever, and to our shock, the Ferris wheel groaned and began to turn. "What the hell?" I muttered. The ride wasn't connected to any visible power source, yet it moved steadily, the creaking metal echoing in the still air. As it picked up speed, one of the cars began to sway violently, the old hinges groaning louder with each rotation. That's when we heard it, a voice crackling through an old, broken speaker on the control platform. "Who started it?" "You have to finish it now," the voice boomed, distorted but clear enough to send a chill through all of us. We froze, staring at each other. The wheel sped up unnaturally, spinning faster and faster until the cars blurred in the dark. Then, through the blur, I saw something, or someone moving inside one of the cars. "Nate, turn it off!" I yelled, but he was already fumbling with the lever. It wouldn't budge. The wheel kept spinning, the voice repeating, "You have to finish it now. You have to finish it now." The shadows inside the cars grew clearer. Figures, dozens of them, pressed against the windows, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on us. Finally, with a horrible screech, the wheel ground to a halt. The speaker buzzed, and the voice said one last thing: "We'll wait for the next ones." We didn't wait to find out what that meant. We bolted, running through the maze of Carnival ruins. As we reached the gate, I made the mistake of looking back. The Ferris wheel stood still, but every car was filled now. Figures sitting motionless, their faces all turned toward us. We never talked about it after that night, but sometimes when I pass by the edge of town, I can see the outline of the Ferris wheel in the distance. And I swear, its cars are still full. The trail through the park was empty. save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I had planned on a quick walk to clear my head, but as I rounded a bend, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A picnic blanket was laid out in a small clearing, complete with a wicker basket, flickering candles, and plates of untouched food. I stopped, glancing around. There was no one in sight, and the scene felt staged, too perfect to be abandoned. Just as I turned to leave, a man's voice called out behind me. "You're just in time," he said, stepping out from the trees with a smile that was a little too wide. The man was dressed neatly, as though he had planned this picnic for someone important. "Please," he said, gesturing to the blanket. "Have a seat. You're the guest of honor." I laughed nervously, trying to play it off. "I think you've got the wrong person." His smile faltered, and his tone shifted. "That's not how this works." The air felt heavier as I backed away, my heart beginning to race. His movements were calm, deliberate, as he stepped closer. "I've been waiting for someone like you," he continued. "It's your turn now." I bolted, running back down the trail, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. His voice carried through the trees, growing more desperate. "You need to take my place. You don't understand." The path twisted and turned, and I sprinted blindly, my chest heaving. When I finally glanced back, he was gone. I slowed, gasping for air, convinced I'd escaped. But as I neared the park entrance, I noticed something chilling. A wicker basket, identical to the one at the picnic, sat on a bench near the trailhead. I didn't stop to check. I ran to my car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. The park disappeared in my rearview mirror as I sped away, trying to push the man's words out of my mind. The next morning, I found it on my doorstep, the same basket, with the same flickering candles and untouched food. A folded note was tucked inside, its edges slightly burned. "Next time, it's your turn." I don't know who he was or what he meant, but the weight of the note lingers. I've tried throwing the basket away, but it keeps returning, always pristine, always waiting. And I can't help but wonder how long I have before I'm the one waiting in the clearing, hoping someone else takes my place. I only needed milk and a few snacks for the week, so I grabbed my items and joined the short line at the checkout. The cashier, a woman in her 40s, scanned items slowly, her eyes darting between me and the register. When it was my turn, she paused, her hand hovering over my carton of milk. "You've been here before," she said, staring at me with a furrowed brow. I shook my head, confused. "No, I haven't. This is my first time." Her expression hardened. She leaned in slightly and whispered, "It's not." The customers behind me began murmuring. When I glanced back, their faces were strangely blank, their eyes unblinking as they watched me. My unease grew as the cashier grabbed my receipt before handing me the bag. "Take this," she said, her voice trembling. "You'll understand soon." I looked at the receipt, expecting the usual list of items and total. Instead, it showed a date and time. Tomorrow at 11:23 p.m. My stomach tightened as I met her gaze again. Before I could ask what it meant, the store's manager appeared, stepping between us. He was a tall man with a forced smile that didn't match the tension in his eyes. "You need to leave," he said firmly, "before it happens again." I left, clutching the receipt tightly, my mind racing. What did she mean? What was this timestamp? I tossed and turned that night, debating whether to return. The next day, my curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to the store at 11:15 p.m., parking in the dimly lit lot. The windows were dark, and a sign on the door read, "Closed for investigation." Still holding the receipt, I peered inside. Shelves were toppled, and the floor was littered with items and broken glass. The place looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. When I got back to my car, I noticed something new on the receipt. The date had changed, this time to the following night at 10:47 p.m. I stared at it, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over me. The moment I got home, I tried throwing it away, but the receipt reappeared on my nightstand the next morning, pristine and unreadable until I touched it. The time updated yet again. I don't go out at night anymore. I avoid grocery stores entirely. But no matter what I do, the receipt keeps changing, the dates drawing closer and closer to midnight. I don't know what's waiting for me when the time finally runs out, but I'm terrified to find out. Because the cashier was right, I have been there before, and I think I'll have to go back again. The desert stretched endlessly in both directions, the road shimmering under the dim glow of my headlights. I've been driving for hours, and my gas gauge suddenly plummeted faster than it should have. The next town was still miles away, but a lone gas station appeared on the horizon, its neon sign flickering like a dying star. The place was eerily quiet, the pumps rusted and worn. A single attendant stood behind the counter inside, grinning widely as I approached. "Late night, huh?" he said, his voice cheerful but unsettlingly smooth. "Where are you headed?" "Just passing through," I replied curtly, handing him cash for the gas. His eyes lingered on me a little too long, and his grin didn't waver. While the tank filled, I rummaged through my car, only to realize my wallet was missing. Panic set in as I searched, but when I went back inside, the attendant was already holding it up. "Looking for this?" he asked, that grin still plastered across his face. "Don't worry, I've added you to the list." I frowned. "What list?" Instead of answering, he opened my wallet and pulled out a photograph. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of me standing in front of the gas station. Across the bottom, a date was stamped, "Later tonight." "Where did you get that?" I demanded, but the man just chuckled, placing the photo back in my wallet and handing it to me. "You should get going," he said, walking back toward the counter. "Wouldn't want to keep them waiting." I didn't ask who them was. My instincts screamed to leave, and I bolted back to the car, slamming the door shut. As I sped off, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something following me. I didn't make it far. The gas gauge plummeted again, despite the full tank. The engine sputtered, and the car rolled to a stop on the side of the desolate road. My hands shook as I tried the ignition, but it was dead. Reluctantly, I turned back toward the gas station. But when I arrived, it was gone. In its place was an empty patch of sand, the sign and building replaced by nothing but barren desert. I stepped out of the car, my phone clutched tightly, desperate for any signal. That's when I saw it, a small photo lying on the ground where the station had been. I picked it up, my breath catching in my throat. It was another picture of me, this time sitting in my car looking terrified. The date had changed, now stamped for tomorrow night. I don't know who's waiting or what they want, but I keep driving. The photograph sits on my dashboard, a grim reminder that I'm running out of road. Because no matter how far I go, the gas gauge keeps dropping, and the desert feels like it's closing in. I've been hiking for hours, lost after taking what I thought was a shortcut. The sun had disappeared, leaving the forest blanketed in shadows, and the cold night air pressed against me like a warning. That's when I saw it, a small lodge nestled among the trees. The windows glowed softly, and a faded sign hung above the door. "Rooms available." Relieved, I hurried to the door and stepped inside. The lobby was warm, but eerily silent. No one was behind the front desk, though the bell sat waiting. I rang it hesitantly, the sound echoing in the emptiness. Moments later, a man appeared from the back. He was tall, with neatly combed hair and a calm demeanor that felt forced. "You look like you need a place to stay," he said, handing me a key before I could even ask for a room. "You'll like this one." The room was small but comfortable, with a bed, a desk, and walls lined with photos. As I examined them, my stomach churned. Each photo showed a different guest standing in the lobby, their expressions frozen in terror. At the center of the wall was a larger photo, freshly framed. It was me, taken moments ago when I'd first entered the lodge. I hadn't seen a camera, and the image showed something I hadn't noticed. Behind me in the lobby was a shadowed figure, its face obscured but unmistakably watching. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, and no matter how hard I pulled, it refused to open. Panic set in as I searched the room for another exit, but the single window was barred from the outside. The photos on the wall seemed to shift as I moved, the eyes of the guests following me. My own photo now had a faint handprint on my shoulder, though I hadn't noticed it before. A knock at the door made me jump. "Is everything all right in there?" The man's voice called out, too calm for the situation. "I need to leave," I shouted, my voice shaking. "You can't," he replied, his tone flat. "You're part of the collection now." Desperate, I grabbed the chair and smashed it against the barred window until the glass shattered. The bars bent just enough for me to squeeze through, cutting my arms on the jagged edges. I sprinted into the woods, the glow of the lodge fading behind me. The trees seemed denser now, their branches clawing at my clothes as I ran. When I finally found the trail again, I gasped in relief. But as I rounded the bend, my heart stopped. The lodge stood in front of me again, its sign flickering faintly. "Rooms available." I haven't stopped running, but no matter where I go, the lodge reappears. And I know if I ever go back inside, I'll become another face on its wall. The ferry looked harmless enough, rocking gently in the water under the dim moonlight. I was running late, so I hurried onto the deck, grateful it hadn't departed yet. The ticket booth was closed, but the ramp was still down, so I figured I'd pay on board. The dock had been eerily quiet, but the ferry was packed. Passengers filled every bench, their faces shadowed and turned downward, as if they were asleep. I found an empty corner near the railing and settled in. The air was heavy with fog, and the hum of the engine drowned out the soft lapping of the waves. The ferry began to move, and I expected the passengers to stir, to chat, look at their phones, or even glance out at the water, but they didn't. They sat in perfect stillness, their heads tilted slightly forward. The intercom crackled, and a distorted voice rang out. "One passenger does not belong. We will find them soon." I froze. The air seemed to thicken as the other passengers slowly raised their heads, turning in unison to look at me. Their eyes gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. "I'm just heading home," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. No one replied. They just stared, their expressions blank but heavy with something unspoken. I stood, trying to steady my shaking legs, and moved toward the nearest crew member, a man in a faded uniform standing by the cabin door. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, pointing a long, bony finger at me. "It's them," he said softly, his voice carrying far too easily over the sound of the waves. The passengers began to whisper, their voices blending into a low hum that seemed to echo from every direction. "It's them. It's always them." Panic surged through me. I pushed past the murmuring crowd, their bodies cold as I brushed against them, and stumbled to the edge of the deck. The dark water churned below. "I don't belong here," I shouted, hoping anyone would listen. The intercom crackled again. Do not leave the ferry. There is no escape. But I didn't wait to find out what that meant. With a deep breath, I climbed over the railing and jumped. The freezing water hit me like a punch, and I fought to surface, gasping for air. When I turned back, the ferry had already disappeared into the fog, gliding silently across the waves. Not a single sound came from its deck. I swam until I reached a small rocky shore, collapsing onto the sand. My clothes clung to me, heavy and cold, as I tried to catch my breath. But when I looked up, my heart sank. Anchored just offshore, barely visible in the mist, was the same ferry. It rocked gently, its deck now empty. I don't know how long I stayed on that shore, but every time I moved inland, the ferry drifted closer. And I know, sooner or later, I'll have to board it again. And the highway was deserted except for the hum of my car slicing through the dark. The only light came from the occasional roadside billboard. Their illuminated ads a brief break from the vast, empty stretches of asphalt. I almost didn't notice the billboard at first. The face staring back at me looked familiar. Too familiar. I slowed down, my stomach dropping as I realized the face wasn't just familiar. It was mine. The text beneath the photo read, "Missing. Last seen tonight." I pulled over to the shoulder, my heart hammering in my chest. The billboard was massive, glowing faintly in the distance, but the details were unmistakable. The photo was me, wearing the same shirt I had on now. Grabbing my phone, I called the number listed on the billboard. The line clicked, and after a long pause, a voice answered. "We've been waiting for you," it said, low and deliberate. I froze. What is this? Who are you? The line went dead. My hands shook as I got back into the car. The highway stretched ahead, endless and dark. I told myself it was a prank, but the unease settled in my chest like a weight. Not long after, I saw another billboard. This one showed a different photo of me, taken from an angle I didn't recognize, like it had been captured without me knowing. The text was different too. Do not run. The air in the car felt heavier as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sped up, desperate to get away from the billboards. But with every mile, a new one appeared, each one displaying another photo of me. One showed me entering my car earlier that night. Another captured me mid-drive, staring nervously at the road. The messages grew more urgent. You can't hide. It's time to come home. The highway felt endless now, the exits disappearing into the dark. My gas gauge inched lower as I pushed the car faster, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. Finally, I saw a rest stop ahead, its flickering lights a beacon in the void. I pulled in, skidding to a stop in the empty lot. Before I could catch my breath, a car pulled up beside me. A man stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. He carried a folder under his arm, its contents spilling out just enough for me to see. A stack of papers, all with my face on them. He smiled, a chilling expression that didn't reach his eyes. "It's time to come home," he said softly, opening the folder and holding out a photo. It was me standing exactly where I was now, the rest stop perfectly captured in the background. I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I sped back onto the highway. The billboards are gone now, but I can't stop driving. I don't know who they are or why I'm on their list, but every time I close my eyes, I see those glowing signs, and I know they're still waiting. The storm came out of nowhere, sheets of rain slamming against the pavement as I rushed down the sidewalk. My jacket was soaked through, and I cursed myself for leaving my umbrella at home. That's when I saw it, a broken umbrella lying on the ground, partially open. It looked abandoned, the fabric torn in a few places, but it was better than nothing. I picked it up, shaking off the rain, and opened it above my head. That's when I noticed the writing. Inside the canopy, in jagged black letters, someone had scrawled, "They're coming." I laughed nervously, chalking it up to a prank, and kept walking. The umbrella did little to keep me dry, but I pressed on, the rain making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. That's when I noticed the shadows. They moved unnaturally, their shapes stretching and contorting on the wet pavement behind me. Every time I stopped, the shadows stopped too, as if they were waiting for me to keep going. I glanced around, but the street was empty. Just me, the rain, and whatever was behind me. The umbrella felt heavier in my hand. Its fabric sagged, the words inside seeming to glow faintly in the dim streetlights. I closed it, deciding I'd rather be soaked than carry it any longer. But as I folded it, a man stepped out of an alleyway ahead of me. He held an umbrella identical to mine, its torn fabric flapping slightly in the wind. His face was shadowed, but I could see his eyes, dark, focused, and locked on me. "That one's marked," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You're part of it now." I backed away, the umbrella slipping from my grasp and landing with a splash. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the rain. The man didn't respond. Instead, he opened his umbrella, the same cryptic phrase, "They're coming," etched inside. He stepped toward me, his movements deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. I turned and ran. The rain stung my face as I sprinted down the empty street, the sound of my footsteps drowned out by the pounding storm. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. When I reached my building, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it tight. The next morning, the rain was gone. The storm had left the streets quiet, and for a moment, I convinced myself it had all been a strange nightmare. But when I opened my front door, the umbrella was there, leaning against the frame as if waiting for me. The writing inside was different now. A single word scrawled in large, jagged letters. "Run." I don't know who they are or what the umbrella's purpose is, but I can feel it. Everywhere I go, they're closer. And I'm running out of places to hide. I'm sorry for any mistakes I've made, and may you all be well.